Welcome to Beyond J, taking conversations worth having from campus to the region, the state, and the world. It's the most important election in history, or so we're told every 4 years, but there's no doubt that politics have become increasingly polarized and even volatile, and with the issues such as economy, the war in Gaza, abortion rights, healthcare, and immigration on the line, the stakes seem to rise with each campaign. Today we'll hear from two Sacramento State professors who can give some historical context to this year's election and provide insight into what could impact the race, such as misinformation, technology, who the voters are, and how they'll be casting their ballots. Rebekkah Mulholland is a professor of history and director of Sac State's Public History program. Their research focuses on LGBTQ studies and the history of race, gender, sexuality, class, and social movements in the U.S. Sac State political science professor Kim Nalder is director of the Project for an Informed Electorate, which is dedicated to providing accurate, trustworthy, and nonpartisan election information. Professors Nalder and Mulholland, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It seems like every election is called the most important election in history. And is this just rhetoric that gets lots of clicks online, or is this, do you truly believe that this is the most important election in history?
So in doing historical research, just because politics play a huge role in what I do, one of the earliest examples I can think of was in 1805. There was a governor's race, I believe, in Pennsylvania. Thomas McKean was running, and the local paper did not want him to win. And so they were encouraging voters to get out and vote against him by employing language similar to that this is our most important election. And so what it did is it encouraged people to get out and vote, because historically American voter turnout is not really high, but then it also helps to sway public opinion on how to vote, who to vote for.
The election in which George Washington chose not to run for a third term and set that precedent, that was an important one. Or 1860, 1864 with the Civil War, those were pretty high on the list. But I think there is some merit to the argument for this particular election because of some of the challenges to democracy we're facing. But more to the point, I think any campaign wants to stir up emotions, and there are a lot of really strong feelings around protecting our system and the need to participate in democracy. And so it's a good turnout technique to say that. It does become kind of crying wolf, though, if you do it every single election.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's why I asked about it, because it feels like I'm constantly being encouraged to fear the outcome of the election. And this is not the first time I felt this. I feel it every 4 years now. But, you mentioned a threat to democracy, I believe were your words. And so... there is these stories coming out about the potential for violence and things that candidates are saying that might lead people to believe that. Do you want to maybe explore that a little bit?
Well, I think we've all got this anxiety about the election, especially since what happened on January 6th of 2021. It might have been sort of a scare tactic or a story before then, but then we actually saw people, smash down the windows of the Capitol and, many injured police officers, which you wouldn't have imagined. That day, sticks in our memories for sure. And I think most people are really nervous about the possibility of something like that happening again. I mean, we saw the attempt to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, governor. There have been other sort of escalations of that violence, and certainly a lot of noise online that makes you think that could happen. And furthermore, there have been polls showing an increasing acceptance in the general public for the idea that maybe political violence is justified sometimes. Maybe there are circumstances under which you might do that. I mean, even if you think to January 6th, those people were lied to, but they believed it. Right? And if you really believed that the election had been stolen by your opponent and they were about to take office, a lot of people might think resorting to violence would make sense in that circumstance. So that kind of acceptance has been growing. And I think that's why people are especially on edge this election.
I mean, even very recently, Elon Musk said that this could be the last election that we see. And it's just like, that's just where my mind goes, is thinking about stuff like January 6th. Is that a threat, or does he mean something else by it? But it's hard when I have this history of things that I've known, that I've heard, that I've witnessed. Dr. Mulholland, historically, have there been other times in which political violence was a factor in the election?
I can just think of direct attacks on even trying to vote. This has been something that has been hard for certain communities, whether we're talking about KKK violence towards Black people simply trying to register to vote, or even being granted permission to go and cast their vote. And so we see violence take different shapes. And of course, these scare tactics are open to interpretation. So of course, people don't know how to respond, and violence just kind of prevenge getting to them before they get to you. So we don't know what's going to happen on election night. And with all of this violent rhetoric taking place, I mean, it's certainly a wild card. And we've seen this play out very violent, very deadly throughout history, and we don't know what's coming, or if it is. So it does kind of cause the hair on the back of our necks to stand up, because what are we about to go into? And we're trying to prepare for it in a way, kind of over-prepare, because we don't know. And I think that's where a lot of the fear comes from. What we hear online, what we see, but also how are we processing it? And people are, in a way, trying to navigate that the best way they can. And sometimes it's just fight or flight. And many people are just like, well, I'm going to fight, and whatever happens, happens. But at least I didn't back down.
No, I think that you hit the nail on the head for me with something that we have witnessed what human beings are capable of doing to one another. So any kind of violence kind of remains on the table. Kamala Harris is running as a Black and Southeast Asian woman, and has tended to avoid using that as a talking point.
She understands what's at stake, especially being first Black woman to really secure the nomination, being Black and of Southeast Asian descent. But she has said herself that she didn't want to identity politic with this election. As they're looking at how their voter base, where they're going, many are leaving the Democratic Party. For example, a lot of Latino voters, specifically men, are very vocal about jumping the Democratic ship and voting for Trump. And what she wants to do with this election, Democrats, I think, are in agreement that they want us to look at the issues that affect us all, regardless of how we identify. So if she wins, I think we'll see a different kind of conversation. Of course, first Black woman, and first woman of Indian descent. We'll see that language come later, but she's been adamant about not wanting that to be a factor as to whether or not she can do the job. She didn't want people to question, okay, you're a woman, can you do this job? Okay, you're the second Black person, and they held Obama to a certain standard, so can she meet that? And being the first person of Indian descent who could possibly take the White House. So she didn't want that to be a factor, how she identified what she looked like, based on, what she says. She wants you to judge her based on her performance and not her intersecting ideologies.
Yeah, which certainly I think is refreshing. I think all of those things will be reasons to celebrate, if and when it happens, but focusing on the politics and not what she looks like or where she came from, I think is great, just as somebody who is a civil rights advocate. Dr. Nalder?
In lots of ways, I think she's learning from and benefiting from the Hillary Clinton example. So, on one hand, now the world can imagine a woman getting the nomination and actually winning more votes in the presidential election, right? So it doesn't seem like this, unlikely modeling. That's part of it, is that we haven't seen a woman do certain things, and so it's not as easy to imagine, and now we have. If you look at polls that over many years have asked, would you vote for a woman for president, or do you think a woman would be a capable president? Different variations on that question. The numbers have, gone drastically up in the last few decades, but it's still to this day not zero. And so there's, some subpopulation that still feels like that's a barrier for them. Now, as far as Kamala Harris is concerned, those people are unlikely to have voted for her anyway, right? They're going to vote Republican. And in some ways, like we did some research on the gendered impressions of Trump and Clinton at the time. And one of the things that we found in our research was that really it was Trump who was running on gender more than Clinton was. That he was all about, sort of swagger and strength and masculine energy as his sort of propelling force, really. And she was trying to walk that tightrope a little bit more and take on the stereotypes of both genders, and that's just really hard to do. So I think, Harris has historically not brought this up in other races as well. I think it's just part of her personality. But she's able to do that because Clinton broke it down ahead of time.
We did talk a moment ago about, political violence, but what do you think that the war in Gaza will have as an effect on this election?
Well, I think the biggest place that we see it play out is within the Democratic coalition. There's a cleavage there. There's certainly, especially younger voters who are much more pro-Palestinian, and then the traditional American support for Israel amongst the older voters and the establishment Democrats. So it's just a really difficult topic. The Islamic American population not traditionally, but in the last several decades, has voted Democratic, but that's largely because of sort of the war on terror stuff that happened under Bush. And then, of course, Trump had the Muslim ban immediately when he took office. So there have been some sort of anti-Muslim activities coming from the Republicans. But this issue is potentially shifting some of those votes. And, we'll see what happens in Michigan, for example, that has a high concentrated population of Muslims. So I think it will make a difference, but we'll see how much.
And I do want you both to answer, but I just kind of want to chime in. And you did mention the younger voters. And I think the reason I wanted to bring this up is because we are on a college campus. And our students have been vocal about the war. And so particularly with college-age voters, how is this playing out?
Many younger voters are understandably upset with the Democratic Party. Many students that I've been talking to recently, because I do hold space in my classrooms for students to just talk about what's on their minds, because they don't feel like they often get that opportunity. And with the issue of what's happening in Gaza, many of our students, are Palestinian or from Lebanon, and we see our leaders continue to give these huge funding packages to places like Israel and even Ukraine. People are frustrated with the economic imbalance that's happening, and they are exploring other ways to vote. Many have pledged to not vote Democrat or vote at all, but they are looking at other parties, specifically the Green Party. And as we're talking about, Muslim Americans, a big coalition just endorsed Dr. Jill Stein for president because of her strong, consistent anti-war, anti-genocide, pro-people, pro-healthcare stances. And so a lot of younger people are out here voicing their frustrations about what's going on. And I think it would behoove the Democrats to listen to that.
Polling accuracy. So polls have, as long as I can remember, been a big topic going into the election. What about the idea of, the difference between the idea that there's maybe potentially shy Trump voters, people who will vote for Trump at the polls but aren't claiming that they will now, versus, say, an unexpected turnout for Harris?
So I have, many lectures on this in my public opinion class, so I'll try to keep it short. That gets a little tricky. But the shift in polling technology has made a big difference in these questions.
Yeah.
So, once upon a time it was all telephone polling, and which was frankly more accurate than what we have today, because
Really?
people, if you go back to like the 1970s, 80s, people would answer their phone because they didn't have an answering machine, especially before answering machines, right? You don't know who it is. It might be your grandma, whatever.
Yeah.
So you're going to answer, and that's gotten impossible and insanely expensive to do telephone polls. So, like we did here with Cal Speaks in 2016, we were one of the first to transition to this online panel format where we recruit people using snail mail, a letter, sent from the university saying, please join our panel sort of thing.
Okay.
But then after that, everything's administered online, and we come back to the same people for multiple surveys. And so that's a technique that's used by an awful lot of pollsters. And so it's really different in the sense that they're not talking to a person anymore, and so they can be more honest. We used to have some issues with, like, you hear the person on the phone. If it's a woman, maybe you're not going to say the sexist thing, or there's just social pressure to say the thing that that's socially acceptable. But as we know, people behind their computer screens are willing to say all sorts of horrible things, and so in some cases it's actually more honest. So we're not as worried about like the shy Trump voter. Even between 2016 and now, that's really been a huge shift. But if we're using something like that panel technology, which isn't the only one that's being used, and some are still telephone, and there are other means of collecting the data, but the online panels pre-exist the election. And so if we have new voter registrants who are motivated by, as we saw after Kamala Harris became the nominee, suddenly voter registrations went up. After Taylor Swift endorsed, we saw, younger people registering because she encouraged that, right? Well, those folks aren't going to be on the panel, right? They haven't already been recruited for that panel.
I see.
And, pollsters do their very best to get accurate results. Like, that is the goal, right? And so there's weighting that happens afterwards to mathematically adjust. But one place where that might not be as accurate is in those first-time younger voters where we don't know their previous behavior in order to make predictions about their likelihood to vote in the future, and we might just be missing them in the first place. So that could benefit a Harris campaign in terms of what the polls look like versus what it might actually turn out to be.
I did want to hear about voting rights and where historically it's been difficult to vote, and where maybe this is something where I don't think I'm aware enough to know that maybe it's still very difficult to vote.
There are places, especially throughout the South, where you see predominantly Black areas. These might be some of the poorest areas. We're seeing, of course, if you are a convicted felon, that's out of the bag. If you are lack of ID, so they put all kind of barriers in place to make it difficult to do what we're told is our civic duty, and that is to vote. So we see that throughout the South, but we're also seeing it throughout the nation as states turn red, or you have more conservative governors taking office, like Ohio are enacting all of these laws, Tennessee, of course. So what we saw historically with poll taxes and literacy tests, well, you're not exactly doing that, but you are playing the same game with different strategies and making it more difficult for people to vote. 2016, I was on those calls seeing how people would vote, but also trying to see if they could go out and vote. Do they have transportation? So in one area, predominantly Black and Latino, this is in Memphis, there are a lot of elderly people who could not get to the polls. So it's like, is this an issue of where we can rent buses or something to get people there? These are people who are not literate, have different limited abilities, whether we're talking mentally, physically, things of that nature. So there's a lot of nuance here that we're really not addressing. So when we talk about voting being difficult, it's not just states against certain groups of people voting. We're talking about, well, how do we get people out there to vote? And that could be different ways of accessing the ballot.
if you think about it, it's kind of bananas in the United States of America when we think of ourselves as, the beacon of democracy in the world, at least we have, that we have record numbers of new laws that are restricting voting, making it harder to vote. Luckily in California, we've gone in the other direction, and I think that's, something the rest of the country could look to. But 2021 had a record number of laws in the states that restricted voting in some ways. So things like, many counties only have one place you can physically drop off your ballot, for example. They've reduced the number of days that one can send in a ballot. They're not going to count ballots in some states if they arrive after Election Day, even if they're postmarked on Election Day. I mean, all sorts of means to limit voting. And that's just, I don't say un-American too much, but that's un-American.
Yeah, when you say that, I'm sitting here thinking to myself, I'm sort of worried that will play into this sort of post-election questioning of how legitimate the election even was.
Exactly.
Right? If things don't go, one way or the other. So with the election right on our heels, what is happening at the Project for an Informed Electorate?
Yeah, so our signature event is an initiative explainer with the Legislative Analyst's Office, where we have the analysts who actually do the initiative analysis for the official voter guide come and explain the initiatives. And there's a chance for people who come to the live event to actually ask them questions, which is pretty invaluable. And then we add in information about endorsements and about campaign expenditures. And most of the time, people can basically make their decision after the 5 minutes per initiative that we spend. But the cool thing is that we make videos from that event that are about 5 minutes per initiative that are available on the PI website. Like in the past, we've mostly gotten Sacramento region folks watching them, but truly it could be statewide. And I think they're really useful. They're nonpartisan. There's no spin. There's no political BS that you get everywhere else. And then we have a couple of events that are coming up, even including a postmortem after the election where we sort of discuss what just happened. So all that detail is available on our website, which is at csus.edu/SSIS/PIE.
I want to jump to some lightning round questions to wrap this thing up. Let's go ahead with give me one election night prediction.
Oh, gosh. That's scary. I don't know. I don't want to make that prediction. Okay. It's so scary.
Okay. Do you have an election prediction?
I did get out of the election prediction business after 2016 when, all of us were wrong, especially somebody who does polls, right? Like I was watching the polls and we were wrong. But I do think that we will see, he's already announced it, that former President Trump is going to announce that he won one way or the other. He's already planning it. And so he'll be saying he won regardless of what happens. We won't know on election night because we do have so many more states now doing mail-in voting, and many of them still allow those to come in after Election Day if they're postmarked in time. And so, the votes won't be counted. It's going to be close as far as we can tell. And so we probably won't know who's won the night of the end of election season, I guess. It's not even election night anymore, but on that day, we're not going to know. But he'll claim victory, and we'll see what the counter strategy is from the Harris campaign.
And we'll see what kind of ways in which political violence takes place. And that's the scary part.
Yeah. Okay, well, maybe even more importantly then, how about your favorite fictional president?
Oh, I love Martin Sheen, President Jed. I can't think of his last name.
President Bartlett. That's everybody's favorite.
Of course. I love him. I just love Martin Sheen.
Okay, this one is important to me. I know I have an opinion on this, but, 2 shorter classes throughout the week, like a Tuesday, Thursday course, or like all day Friday?
Tuesday, Thursday course. I need my Fridays.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I need my Fridays.
That's not even a question.
Well, see, I loved Friday classes, but I think maybe because I was in studio arts, it was like this opportunity just to I could paint for 6 hours on a Friday, and it's probably the most exhausting thing I've ever done in my life. Even compared to working for the city of Sacramento, cutting trees for 8 hours. Like, I could do that, but painting was like this emotionally exhausting thing.
That's because you could get into the flow, literally that thing of flow.
Yeah.
But have you seen attention spans? Like,
Yeah. And then I teach history, and depending on the topic of that, I don't want to set the tone for somebody's weekend. At least not in, a terrible way.
I know I'm the rare breed in this one.
But if I was in studio arts, I would have loved Fridays too.
Yeah. Well, that's what we want Fridays for, is like we can do our research or, things like that, where we need to get into that flow state for a lot of hours in a row. And you can't really do that on teaching days.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you both being here. And I wish that we had 2 hours or even longer to talk, because I feel like we're just scratching the surface. But thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Beyond J is a production of University Communications at Sacramento State. Our producer is Jonathan Morales. Photography and videography by Bibiana Ortiz. Additional research by Jennifer K. Morita. And editing by me, your host, Philip Allstott. If you liked this episode, please leave us a review and consider following us on your favorite podcast platform. If you have questions or comments, email us at communications@csus.edu and visit us online at csus.edu/beyondj.